these business processes are the tasks, the actions, the activities that are required to produce the outcomes that the system is there to sustain.
Strategy is standard. But leading people, that's where the magic happens. In every organization, there comes a moment, a shift, a stretch, a choice. How do you help your people thrive? Give them the voice, the tools, and the leadership they deserve.
I'm Ronda.
And I'm Kevin.
Welcome to the Wolf Pack Rise Howl podcast, where we talk about what it takes to lead, coach, and transform from the inside out.
Good morning, Kevin. How are you doing?
Good morning, Ronda. I am doing fantastic on this Friday morning in the ATL.
Cool. I'm doing all right on this Friday afternoon in the NL. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. I just want to talk about the importance of systems. I mean, I think we've touched on this lightly before, but I was speaking with someone recently, about a week and a half ago, and this individual has got a pretty tall order of trying to implement culture across their organization, which, you know how we feel about culture. It's really vitally important. And, culture makes or breaks a company as far as I'm concerned. And so we were talking, and I want to ask you, have you ever had a time where you've worked with a company that comes up with really great concepts for culture and they sound fantastic, and they have these PowerPoint decks that map everything out. They've got great graphics and everything looks good, sounds fantastic. But then there's no infrastructure to actually support the execution of this endeavor. And the more and more that I was speaking with this individual, it just reminded me of how many times I have encountered this where, there's well-intended people in an organization. They want to get things done. They've got a vision in their mind. They've got a great concept, great idea. They understand the value, but they just can't seem to get from point A to point B on it. And I've come to the conclusion that it's a lack of system, or it's broken processes, or a combination of both. I don't see how you can function effectively without these things in place. Yeah.
And Rhonda, to answer your question, my answer is yes. As you know, my resume, I've worked for 3 Fortune 500 companies, a Big 4 professional services firm, a couple of smaller companies. And so, yes, I've had plenty of opportunity to see exactly what you're talking about. And I always would refer to those projects, initiatives, plans, et cetera, as the best laid plans, but a lot of them fail to be able to be fully executed. They would sort of die on the vine, if you will, or they be introduced with the largest splash in the world, and then they would sort of like fade as time went on or whatever. And so I think what I experienced in those instances is where you're going in today's conversation.
Well, yeah, and I'll add to that. Unfortunately, on top of what you just said, I think what happens then is that the blame game starts to kick in. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, people start to look at other people and start to think that, it's somebody's fault. And, I think that, some leaders might think that their biggest problem is people. But a lot of times, it's not the people, it's the system that people are stuck with having to deal with, that they're trapped inside of a system, or they're trying to navigate broken processes. And so I'm not going to say that I'm going to make a quote, because I don't have the quote memorized for word, but James Clear, who wrote the book Atomic Habits. Have you read that?
Atomic Habits, no.
Something to the effect of like, you're not going to rise to your goals. Basically, goals don't make things happen. It's the systems in
Mhm.
place that get things done, that make things happen. I told you I was going to
Mhm.
botch that up, but anyway,
Well,
great
no, I
book.
get the gist.
Yeah,
Basically, what you're saying is the system is the enabler.
right,
You
right.
can have the best laid plans, goals, objectives, etc. But if the system, if the infrastructure, the term that you used earlier on, is if it doesn't enable you to execute the goals and objectives, then you're dead on arrival.
Right. And as part of the system, the processes that make up that system, if they're unclear, they're inconsistent, they're broken, they're ineffective, then you don't have a process. You have an idea of a process. You have a rumor. You have a
Mhm.
hopeful wish of a process, and you have a concept of a system. But first, I want to start by identifying the difference between a system and a process. And for those of you out there who already know this, you can fast forward or whatever. But basically, the system itself is the larger overarching set of connected parts that produces the results. Okay, it's your people, it's your tools, it's your collateral, it's your policies, it's your SOPs, your data. The system is basically, if it's like the bigger overarching net of everything. The processes are the little pieces that make up the system. These are the repeatable things that you do on a daily basis as part of your work processes. These business processes are the tasks, the actions, the activities that are required to produce the outcomes that the system is there to sustain. Does that make
Mhm.
sense? So
Perfect.
it could
Mhm.
be, the process of hiring someone, the process of onboarding them, the process of you know, what does it look like to conduct a family of job tasks related
Mhm.
to, something else. So there's the system, and then there's the process. And process mapping is kind of like the picture of what these processes look like when they're strung together, and what happens in order to complete the process. Who does what, who owns this, what decisions have to get made, what tools are used in the process of executing that process. So when you look at the processes, which is zooming in, you this is where you can start to see where things actually start to break. And in
Mhm.
speaking to our topic today, this is where you can actually see things where things originate from and where they start to build up. So if you, for example, like I was using this conversation I was having, if you want to execute a new culture initiative across an organization, first you've got to start with, well, what does that look like? What do we mean when we say our culture? That's can be very nebulous, very vague, very subjective. But if you really want to specify the types of behaviors and traits that are associated with the kind of culture that you're trying to foster in your organization, you need to write it down. You need to be very clear about that. You need to have an understanding of what the end picture is going to look like. What are the outcomes that are going to result from the type of culture that you want to cultivate in your company? Does that
Mhm.
make sense?
Perfect.
And so in doing so, how does that trickle down? So then that means that if you are a company let's use something really easy. We want to be a company that's known for our excellent customer service. Well, what does that look like? Well, you'd have to have a system in place for your customer service, for your retention, for loyalty, for dealing with complaints, for how do you serve the customer. And that system could then be made up of processes. Okay, well, what's the process of intaking a customer complaint? And then what's the decision? What are your business rules about how you're going to deal with said customer complaints? You know,
Mhm.
how do you empower your employees to actually deal with a customer complaint? That's all a part of the process, because empowerment is going to be hinged upon the decisions that you allow that person to make in the moment. See? And then
Mhm.
another system that could be within your organization, that would touch up against that, for example, would be, well, what, how does HR come into play here? How have you set expectations with performance measurements, and what are the KPIs? How does that employee measure up in terms of what you set in place for performance standards that they have to meet with regard to the various systems and processes that are associated with their particular job? So
Mhm.
when you start with the outcome in mind, and you back your way into, well, what steps are required to execute that, that's where you start to be able to build out an actual framework for your systems and your processes.
Mhm.
And I would have to say, Kevin, it takes time.
Mhm.
And I think that's where we get lost in the sauce, because people want things, but they don't necessarily want to invest in what it takes to get those things. What do you say about that? What's Give me some good news. You have something to counter that? What's been your experience as far as that goes?
Yeah, yeah, no, you're right on point, Rhonda. I was sitting here thinking about those experiences, as you were talking, trying to reflect back to my own personal experience. And a common thread to what you just said was that the leadership comes up with some, I mean, really some good ideas, but they aren't always fully vetted prior to wanting to execute them. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and you've shot yourself in the foot from the very start, if you will, by not having it properly vetted. And when I say properly vetted, not just vetted by people who sit on the upper tier of the organizational chart. Um, it has to be fully vetted down to, let's just say, to the worker bees, if you will, just to make sure that all of the kinks are ironed out, that it's something that can realistically be executed, if you will. But unfortunately, that doesn't happen from the very beginning, if you will. And then another thing that I thought of is, you know, when it cascades down, if you will, the org
Mm-hmm.
chart to the rest of the organization from the leadership, there are certain filters along the way, and unfortunately, those filters aren't consistent. And what I mean by filters is, the approach, the thoughts, the ideas behind what's going to be executed, and sometimes they get skewed. As it gets cascaded down, it gets maybe just a little bit different from what was initially intended, if you will. Yeah, it's consistent on paper, but in terms of the execution of it or whatever, sometimes it goes awry because it's being filtered by different people who, as it goes down, that aren't on the same page. So by the time that it reaches its most bottom rung or whatever, you have something that might be entirely different than what was visioned by the leadership that initiated this particular change, this project or program or whatever. So, but to go back to what you're saying, you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, the initiation of these, you know, different changes, programs, projects, etc., um, don't get a proper start, and so therefore you're just fraught with all kinds of issues over time, and that's why sometimes these things never really come to full fruition.
Well, I really want to touch on something that you said. I like cascading down is absolutely correct. And where business process mapping can come into play, you analyze what's going on. because this wonderful vision that could be in the leader's mind about how they want the outcomes to be, there needs to be careful consideration given to making sure that that's articulated well and in such a way that you can describe the desirable behaviors and characteristics and attributes that are associated with performing the tasks necessary to execute the process to that's associated with a system in order to get the outcomes that are desired. Excuse me. And I'm not trying to make a whole bunch of extra words, but it is that detailed. It requires that level of detail. And the reason why it's so important is because only when you get to that point of detail are you going to be able to assure consistency across the board. Because, like you said, that messaging can very easily get warped and twisted, misinterpreted, and miscommunicated from the top down. By the time you start at the top, it's one thing. By the time you disseminate it all the way down to boots on the ground, it's a completely different understanding of what we're trying to do. And then people start pointing the fingers. Well, so and so didn't do it right. Well, so and so didn't tell me that I wasn't doing it right. Well, da 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 da. So that's why it's important to go ahead and take the time and invest in putting these things together. Because once you get it right the first time, then you have a living document, you have a living way of doing things. And then and only then can you have a creed that everybody can agree to and everybody understands it. And then there's no questions, there's no confusion because it's all written down, it's mapped out, and there are other things. It's not just as simple as just writing it down. You have to practice. You have to be very consistent with the way you communicate what it is that you're doing consistently and frequently, like we've talked about in terms of change strategies. It's not just a one and done kind of thing. It's a way of being. And not only by putting forth that effort are you going to be more likely to have consistency, but in doing so, there's a heavy lift on the front end, but it reduces a lot of waste. It reduces rework. And if you think about it, for those who want to save money on the front end, excuse me, there are hidden costs associated with doing work over again and being wasteful and not being very productive. And I tell you, it doesn't take much to start to see how much those costs can be when they start to add up. Poor quality can cost you productivity, poor productivity. I mean, all those things. At the end of the day, let's start with quality. Poor quality, if that affects your customer experience, you're putting yourself quite a bit at risk there. So all the money that you spend on marketing and sales and brand recognition and all of this, why would you leave the rest of it up to chance with broken processes or non-existent processes or inconsistent processes or broken system? Why would you leave any of that infrastructure up to chance? You've invested all of this money attracting and getting customers in, and then you're going to put quality and put your brand on the line and risk it all because you don't want to invest in getting your systems right and making sure everybody's aligned and that you have everything that you need so that there's no question about how we do things. What's our way of being, So that I just wanted to start off with that because when I was talking to this person, like I said, and they're really super fantastic, smart person. They really have a lot of heart into what they're trying to do. But I'm like, dude, you need something else, man. You need an infrastructure to support what you're trying to do. There's no amount of coaching or wishful thinking or getting on a call and having a leadership, conference or whatever. There's no amount of any of that that's going to
Mhm.
make sure that you get the throughput that you need to get this across the organization and get people moving in such a way that when you walk in, you can see the behavior, you can recognize it, and you know, yep, that's our culture in action right
Mhm.
there. I can see it, smell it, hear it, taste it. That takes
Yeah.
an incredible amount of effort on the front end, but once you lock it down, you're good, you know?
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I have a question for you. So, in this particular scenario that you're describing, the conversation, if you will,
Mhm.
um, at what point was this? Was this a discussion about a particular project or change initiative that had already been executed, or is this, we're about to execute this? Um,
No, no,
I'm
this
just
was
curious.
just someone called because, and rightfully so, they were kind of on the right track. They were wanting to know about how can coaching play a role in this, which
Okay.
absolutely coaching can play a role in this. It's one of the ingredients, okay? But after sussing out the situation, and I realized there's a lot more to this particular person's situation
Hmm.
than meets the eye, you know, um, because yes, coaching is absolutely a part of that, but coaching alone is not going to bring about the outcomes that are desired because
Hmm.
there was a lot more at play here. Like
Hmm.
they're, and
Hmm.
there's more needed, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But basically, the conversation reminded me not necessarily of that person's organizational problems, but just in general, it got me thinking this is a common theme that I've seen over the years where you start off hot and heavy, hey, we've got this campaign, blah, 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 blah. Everybody's all on board with it. They're all excited about it. They dump a lot of money into hiring, marketing agencies and PR agencies and branding and they put together videos and like I mean, depending on how big the campaign is, they're spending a lot of money to like bring it to life in a graphical perspective. Like that's surface level stuff. Like it looks good. That's like they build this big, beautiful car. It's got a great paint job. It's like really gorgeous. And it's like, yeah, man, that's the car I want to drive in. And then you hop in the car, you put the keys in, and the car doesn't go anywhere because there's no gas in the tank.
Yeah. So Rhonda, what you're describing is which I saw a lot of over the years in what we're discussing as far as projects that sort of faint out, if you will. Um, they start out with a lot of sizzle, but
Yeah.
unfortunately, it lacks any substance. Okay, and then a year later, year and a half, whatever, that particular initiative gets placed in a category what I describe as flavor of the month because
Yeah.
it was hot and heavy at one period of time or whatever for whatever reason or a number of different reasons that you described already.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't work out, and it was just you could label it as that was something that was everybody was excited about. It was the thing.
Yeah.
Something else that you and I have talked about in the past too is perhaps following the leader. This is
Yeah.
the hot, this is the new shiny toy, if you will, in the market. So we need to be doing this because if we want to remain competitive, and maybe
Yeah.
so, but if you don't
Yeah.
go about it in the right way in terms of properly setting up the infrastructure that you've described or whatever, and then guess what? Again, it's not going to it's not going to be substantive enough, and it will fizzle out over a period of time. So.
Yeah, and I want to speak to that as well because you're right. It does become a flavor of the month or the year rather. And then there's this constant cycle of starting over because then it's like we're on to the next thing. And I just want to say that, it really I wonder if some of these companies that do this are they having an identity crisis because I am this the question in my mind is why are we doing this again?
Hmm.
Who are you? Like why?
Yeah.
Why do you have another big huge splashy campaign? Like what's going on?
Yeah.
Know thyself, please.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
take time to know thyself and dig deep. Don't rush it. Don't rush it at all. And you know, and this is where and I say that and I've written an article about this, but I wrote this I wrote these multiple articles that are connected and linked, and I never put them out. I think I need to put them out. But this is where your vision, your mission, your values are all tied together
Hmm.
with your culture. And you have to know thyself as an organization because, how are you going to clearly state what your mission is if you don't understand yourself as an organization? And if you don't know yourself as an organization, how can you confidently say what your culture is or what's your special sauce? If you
Hmm.
don't know that really, or you think you know, but you're like all over the place with it. And if your culture is not something that should change because of market trends. There I said it. I mean, period. Your
Hmm.
values shouldn't change because of market trends.
Hmm.
And so once you are firm in what your philosophical beliefs are as an organization and what you stand for as an organization, and you
It should
set
always
that
remain static. Yeah.
right,
Hmm.
right,
Yeah.
and that becomes a core part of what your mission is, and that should drive everything. And then your vision might change due to market trends. Maybe you get down the road and you're like, hey, we understand that maybe our vision has changed because we've got to move in a different direction. But who we are, our fiber of our core, our being, our values, our integrity, our way, who we are, how we move as people, honesty, integrity, and all of these things, that really shouldn't change all that much, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Or at all. I would argue at all. You know, when you talk about ethical practices, integrity, and those types of things, that should be a constant. That should be static throughout, never change,
I
never move.
agree. I agree with that. But to be devil's advocate, I will say this. I could imagine if you started off as a small, like mom and pop company, say
Hmm.
50 employees or something really super small, I would imagine that as you get bigger, there's one company that I have in mind. It was a past client. When they started way back in the day, I mean, way, way back, times have changed, okay? They started off as one kind of company doing something completely different, and then they completely shifted and got into a completely different industry, and they started off as some little small little family owned thing, and then they blew up to now they are a global organization. Under those circumstances, absolutely a whole lot of things are going to change.
Oh
Okay,
yeah,
the
absolutely. Yeah,
baseline stuff, be honest, be good, don't be a jerk, those things should
yeah.
obviously. But I would say that under massive growth and very very sharp um, changes in industry could definitely could bring on cultural differences that require you to change your culture a little bit, because as you become more of a global company like they did, and you
Hmm.
have to factor in things that you never had to factor in before. A
Yeah.
50 person company, there are certain things that they don't really have to factor in,
Hmm.
not only
Hmm.
from a philosophical perspective, but even from a legal perspective. For example,
Yeah.
once this is an HR person, under a certain number of employees, you don't have to have, um, you know, um, there's certain things like, I think is it,
Yeah, there's a lot of governmental
workers,
regulations that
governmental
don't come
stuff,
into
right?
fruition until there are 50 employees or more.
Right,
By the
right.
way, in your example, you are spot on. I don't know if you remember this from my resume, but I was I was a consultant at the time, and I got hired to build the HR infrastructure for a small organization that had plans to grow by leaps and bounds. And they did, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
When I came on with them, I started writing policies and procedures and finding benefits plans, looking at all that kind of stuff or whatever, when it was just 11 employees, seven of which were the founders of the organization, and the other four were contractors just like myself in different spaces, if you will. Long story short, the company grew from the original 11 when I came on to over 400. And this was like almost like right at 2 years when we hit 400 employees or whatever. And the organization, obviously, to your point, changed significantly on a whole different number of different platforms from the
Mm-hmm.
time that it was 11 to the time that it was over 400 or whatever.
Yeah.
And the challenge there was to try to maintain the core mission, vision, values, if you will, that were established when the organization was just basically born, if you will. And it
Yeah.
does change. And unfortunately, the sad part to this was during the dot-com phase that we were experiencing. And we got gobbled up by another organization because there was a lot of that activity going on. And then as we got gobbled up by another larger organization, they had the same issues in terms of their identity because they were acquiring other companies like ours. And I say all of that to say this, not to get us off on a tangent or whatever, but that whole thing about the ethics and and doing the right thing and all that kind of stuff or whatever. It's very important, and that's why organizations, the best practiced organizations, will on a routine, regular basis, at least annually, will remind employees of what their core vision, mission, and values are, and how important it is to operate, ethically and so forth. So that's my
Mm-hmm.
spiel on that.
You, I was looking something up real quick while you were explaining that, and you said growing from 11 to 400 in a 2 year period. That's a lot. So,
That's when I started getting gray hairs, by the way, because I stayed with that organization before we initially or formally launched. I actually went from a W-9 to a W-2 employee or whatever, and I headed up the HR department for the company. And let me tell you, it was, I don't know where those 2 years went, but I was on roller skates
yeah, I
because
bet.
of all of the things that we had to do in terms of the growth. But
Well,
yeah.
when you were talking, it reminded me of something, and I wanted to I wanted to read that because I remember. Are you familiar with this book? It's rather old now. It's called The Tipping Point.
S. I didn't
How
read
little
it, but
things.
yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
well, you reminded me because there's key details regarding this concept of number of employees in the book, and I'm just going to read right off. So the magic number is 150. So based on research by British anthropologist Robin Dunbar, Malcolm Gladwell, who wrote that book, explains that 150 represents the maximum number of individuals with whom humans can maintain stable, genuine social relationships.
Mm.
And some days I feel like the number's more like five, but that's another story for another day.
Wow.
um, so in regard to in regards to organizational efficiency, the book argues that in groups larger than 150, social cohesion breaks down and it becomes harder for people to work together effectively. And I have seen that in action. And I swear, I talk about silos being like my pet peeve. I hate that, but I think this is where it must come from. People get kind of tribal even inside of organizations. They get really possessive of their knowledge in their department, in their group, in their division, whatever.
You
And they
think?
just, I think I have a hunch. I might have seen it a time or two. Yeah. Um, so anyway, he goes on to say that Um, there's a company, Gore-Tex, Gore and Associates is a company that successfully applies this rule. They restrict their manufacturing plants to no more than 150 employees to maintain a close-knit, efficient, and productive workplace. Splitting groups. When a plant or group at Gore-Tex grows beyond 150, it is split into two separate, smaller, and independent groups to maintain that small company feel and facilitate easier communication. In the context of the power of context, one of three rules of epidemics, keeping work units below this size ensures that employees feel responsible for one another and can work together based on personal relationships rather than rigid bureaucracy. That sounds great. You know what? And I love that. But that just begs the question, companies are bigger than 150 people. And
Mhm.
I like that. I believe that can be accomplished and achieved. And again, I'm going to go back to the original topic of today, systems. You can have a
Mhm.
system for that. And if you have these small groups of, you restrict them to 150 or maybe less according to some other measures, I still believe that just it's still very important to have a clean, consistent, and well articulated culture, mission, vision, leader's intent, and everything from the top down. And then, and also, I think that it would be more manageable if you had these smaller divisions, if you will, of 150 or less, and you have clearly defined roles above each of those, and that so that there's consistency in the messaging. And
Yeah,
I,
yeah,
I
and
do,
They're replicated.
right,
The
right.
smaller subsystems are replicated and still in sync, orchestrated, if you will, with the entire
Right,
system.
because
Yeah.
imagine if you had 10 groups of 150. So you have 1,500 employees, but there's 10 groups. And over each of those groups of 150, you may have one or two layers of leadership. I don't know,
Mhm.
maybe two leaders per 150 pod, directors, whatever. I don't know. And then one main one over them. But either way, you'd have no more than 25 because you'd have, if you had two per pod, that's 20. And then those two would have, leaders over, just, that's a much more manageable number of people to get everybody consistently on board with the messaging. As long as they just simmer down and then it's out and then down and then out, and it's not just like, hey, straight down, boom, to the masses. I want to, put out this initiative. I got this philosophy, this thing that I'm trying to do across a massive organization without some branching and some breaking down and a structured hierarchical mechanism in order to disseminate that across the organization. And again, this is where your systems and your processes are going to come into place and help you to get that across. So whoever's listening, please take from this. Like, take the time to first know yourself. Second, be super clear about what your business objectives are, and then build your vision. Know thyself and use that to build your mission. Like, why do you
Mhm.
exist? Okay, map out what your core strategic business objectives are and use that to guide your vision. Okay, and by all means, dear gosh, build your infrastructure, build your systems, put your processes in place. Take the time to do that. Once you put that in, and they can be replicable and people can understand them, and you will reduce the hidden costs of rework and duplication of effort and lost productivity and loss of quality due to not adhering to the vision and the values and the culture that you're trying to get across, because you fail to plan and you fail to build that infrastructure to support it. And
Mhm.
always keep in mind, ultimately at the end of the day, your whole entire brand is at risk if you don't get this right, because customers can smell this a mile away.
Hmm.
I mean, isn't that what we're here for? To serve our customers?
Mm.
Because without
That's a,
them, what do you have?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You know, one thing that you mentioned, Rhonda, that also resonates with me is that I heard you use or reference rework. And sometimes
Mm,
it's inevitable because there's always an ebb and flow of, commerce. Sometimes there are things beyond an organization's control in the marketplace that, you have to pivot. Okay. And, a particular program, project, or change initiative sometimes will become stalled. But if properly laid out and properly initiated or whatever, even if you have to take a time out, if you will, you can come back to it, pick up where you've left off, or, you know, because you have the proper infrastructure or the proper system in place to begin with that allows you to go back in and pick up. Because sometimes there are legitimate interruptions in programs that get initiated or whatever, and then but if it wasn't properly executed from the very beginning, it's very difficult to come back. And if it is come back to or whatever, it's sometimes executed entirely different than what was originally intended, if you will. So that's why it's very important. I just wanted to make that comment though, because sometimes there are, very legitimate reasons why a particular project does stall out because of things that happen. One example would be something that we experienced 4 or 5 years ago called the pandemic.
right.
Okay. So, yeah,
Well,
just want to make that
that's
point.
true. And I want to throw something else out there too. And let me know what you think about this. I am a fan of you know, you need to have a failure plan in place as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, seriously, come up with your protocol of your 10 worst case scenarios that could happen, and build a system around that.
Mm-hmm.
I
What
mean,
if?
how many times have you actually heard leaders talk about a system to fail
Mm-hmm.
deliberately? Like, let's put a system in place for failure. Let's actively plan how we will fail. How will we fail?
Mm-hmm.
What's going to be our reaction, our response to a failure? Um, and plan for that and have a system for that too. If
Yeah,
all
hence
hell's
what if?
breaking loose, right? I may be really super naive, because just because nobody's talked to me about it doesn't mean that people aren't talking about it. But I can tell you, nobody's ever talked to me about it. I've never heard anybody talk about this one instance. And this is when I worked with a data center company, because that's their business, to keep businesses up and running. So when you're talking about business continuity, they are in the business of helping you be prepared for a failure. And so they
Mm-hmm.
think about things differently, because they've got to keep things up and running. So do you see what I'm saying? And the
Oh,
other thing,
absolutely.
the other industry, I apologize. There's another one. When I worked in oil and gas here in the Netherlands, I worked for a software company. They developed a control of work software for oil companies like this. When you're in a critical safety environment, you better have a system in place for how you're going to respond to a failure, because it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when, unfortunately. So I would imagine that companies that are in um, critical safety environments absolutely have fail systems in place, and that they have protocols for how to respond.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Yes,
they're called contingencies.
right, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I believe that every company, no matter what industry, needs to take a page out of their book. you could be, Susie's cupcake stand, and like you need to think about it. Well, what will you do if there's
Well, I'll tell you what Susie's Cupcake stand should be thinking about if they're operating in the ATL. Okay. There's a forecast of a pretty significant storm that's going to come through. There's the likelihood because the power company is telling everybody, be prepared because your
mhm.
power is more than likely going to go out or whatever.
Right,
So
right.
Susie should have a contingency, if you will, on yeah, yeah. So you get the gist of what
Well,
I'm saying.
Susie
Yeah,
Susie might have a contingency on deliveries not being able to get to her. Maybe she needs to plan
there you
ahead to
go.
get her sugar and her flour and her butter and her eggs going.
The
Um,
way I thought about logistics and transportation because that was one of my stops along my career in heading up HR for a small logistics company. And there would be things that would come up. And so we would have to think about, okay, the mode of transportation, whether it be
mhm.
rail or ship or whatever.
Mhm.
So yeah, 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 you're absolutely right. And I think any and all organization should kind of think along those lines, and especially when they're initiating a significant or change
Well,
initiative.
and that really speaks to the critical importance of having a certain level of business acumen. If you're a leader, if you're a small business owner, entrepreneur, whatever, you really need to stop and think about those things. And I don't mean to sound so cynical, but again, critical safety environments, companies that operate in those types of under those, they're highly regulated, so they
Mm-hmm.
are naturally going to be doing these things because not
True.
only because by
Yeah.
gosh you better do it or there's going to be loss of life and other catastrophic things, but they're regulated, so they have to be different. But Joe Schmo, Cupcake Company, T shirt shop, blah, blah, blah. A lot of times they're just flying by the seat of their pants. They start these businesses, they're super successful, they're making money, and before you know it, they've blown up and they don't have a system in place in case there's, I don't know, maybe the boll weevil comes out and like destroys a whole bunch of cotton somewhere. I don't know. I'm just making this up. And then bam, you have no t-shirt. I don't know, dude. I'm just fill in the blank, whatever the thing would be that you would have to create a contingency for. And again, back to the original topic, this is why you need a system for that. You need to have a system for potential failures, work stoppage, business. What can bring your business to its knees? An ice
Mm-hmm.
storm, um, a logistical situation like what happened in 2020 when you couldn't get car parts
Mm-hmm.
for your cars and you couldn't get lumber,
Mm-hmm.
and that affected the housing industry, and then wood was super super duper expensive, and like everything that I hope that we learned from back then.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That was what I wanted to talk about today, and I hope that it's been meaningful and just a good reminder to folks out there to hey man, don't get caught with your proverbial pants down.
Yeah.
Build a
And
system
but
for that.
yeah, and by the way, Rhonda, I mean this it applies what we're talking about to just about anybody and everybody in the organization, but really, really, this should resonate with. I think you're speaking more to leaders, the ones who birth the ideas and the projects and the initiatives or whatever to initiate within their organizations. They are the ones that hey, it all starts with them.
Yeah, that's true, and that's who I am speaking to, because they are in charge of making sure that these things get done, and
Oh, and by the way, that's who White Wolf gets engaged by the leaders. They want White Wolf to come in and help with change initiatives, this, that, and the other. So that's one of the reasons too why, Rhonda, I'm sure you know your message really is going out to the leaders because those are the
well, yeah,
people who bring it
and
in.
Yeah, that's true. But I also am of the opinion too that everybody in an organization can be a leader. Everybody can has the ability to lead, and so if you are not a leader by role or designation, but you are working within an organization, you definitely have the power and the ability to speak up and manage up. And if you see something, say something
Ooh,
about it. Get it back to the
ooh,
leaders.
ooh.
Everybody has the ability to be a leader. I don't care if you're the janitor or whatever. You can lead by
Rhonda,
example.
Rhonda, Rhonda, you just spoke into existence a future podcast. Oh my God.
Okay, okay. Do
Okay,
tell.
write that one down. I love it.
I'll let you take that one
Oh,
on. You
I,
see,
I, I, I read a book or two last year on that very topic or whatever. So yeah, let's make sure that we serve that one up at some point this year.
well, I'll let you take the lead on that one.
All right, we'll do gladly.
All right. Well, I think we've significantly picked that bone today. And do you have any final thoughts on systems and processes and things?
No, I really can't add anything more than what you said. I think you laid it out for us. It's important that they be well thought out from the very beginning before any kind of change initiative, project, program, what have you, is launched, if you will. And just understanding all of the various components that make up a system and how those components should interact with each other to keep the system whole. And I think you touched upon all of that during the course of our conversation. So thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I'll just add one last little final thing. I believe that it's also would be a good practice to check in periodically and do an analysis, do a system and process analysis to make sure that, because like you said, things change, needs come up, um, visions can change. So we want to make sure and build that into our process, make a system for that, that we have a system of continuous improvement and self-analysis, and as such we will commit to checking in. I don't know if it's every 2 years, 5 years, whatever the case may be, to ensure that our systems and processes are still sufficiently supporting the organization
Mm-hmm.
and continuing to enable the organization to generate the outcomes that it says that it wants and
Mm-hmm.
measure that. That's the other
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, they have to be detailed, specific, and they have to be measurable. So
Yeah.
measure how are your processes going? How is the system? How is it functioning? You need to be able to do a little testy test on it every now and again and make sure it's still working the way
Mm-hmm.
that it should. And that begets even more little moving bits and bytes and little parts. It's just that's where the devil is in the details, because in order to pull all of this off effectively, you do have to get down and dirty in the details, the nooks and the crannies of
Yeah.
everything, um, to make sure that people are actually walking the walk and not just talking the talk, you know?
Yeah. Certainly. Checks and
So,
balances have to be in place. Yeah.
well, yeah. And
All
this
right.
also, reminds me of, I don't know how many podcasts ago where we talked about the different levels of leadership, remember?
Yep. Yep.
So,
Yep.
this would be something that would be tasked for managers to keep an eye on. Leaders
Yeah.
would, create the vision and inspire people to follow their leadership. But they're not there to manage. But they can absolutely empower their managers to ensure that the vision is being executed all the way down through the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how management should go. That's how it should go.
And on that note, by the way, yeah, we did do a podcast several months ago on that very topic. But going forward in the podcast that I was suggesting that we do in the future with regards to everybody exhibiting leadership in an organization, we could go back and revisit some of what we talked about
Yeah.
last year in that podcast. So yeah,
Yep.
absolutely.
And that takes empowerment. Hint hint.
Yep.
You got to
Yep.
empower your people so that they
Hmm.
even, and you have to employ trust. They have to be able to trust you, that you mean what you say, and that you are earnest when you say that you are going to empower them to be their own leaders. They
Hmm.
have to feel safe in doing that. It's like, do you see how this just turns into like just it's all just this really finely tuned, connected mesh of so many different things to make all
Hmm.
these things work together
Hmm.
well, you know? So,
Yeah.
I mean, we could touch on
Yeah.
so many things, you know?
Yeah.
It's just, I don't know, it's just like this whole little ecosystem inside of an organization and all the little moving parts and all the little different things that make these things work.
And
So,
that's exactly what it is, ecosystem.
yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, Kevin, thanks for the conversation today. Thank you, everybody, for listening or watching. Please join the conversation. You can reach us at www.whitewolfinc.com and let us know what you would like to talk about, for us to talk about next. We would be most grateful for you to give this video a like if you found this of value. And if you know of anybody that would benefit from its message, please do share. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to our channel. Thank you so much, and we will see you next time on the Wolf Pack Rise and Howl podcast. Everybody have a great weekend.
Thank you, Rhonda. You do the same.
All right,
Take
take
care,
care.
everyone.